time to that they're trying to turn into standard that can be used by CSERT. Be careful when you're looking at number of incidents. How people measure what an incident really is can be very different. And so just saying the number of incidents doesn't usually really tell you anything. You may want to look at, are we seeing the same types of incidents even though we thought we resolved them? Because that means that there's an issue that's not being taken care of. And that's where at the bottom, the part about collecting root cause information is important and can be resonate with executives, with your oversight, with your management and stakeholders, because if you're seeing the same thing after you think it's been addressed and mitigations put in place, this probably means there's other problems that need to be handled. Here are just some of the assessment instruments that are out there. This is just some of them. There are other ones out there. And then Barbara is going to talk to us at the end of this module about the one from Mitre on the maturity model for CSERT. The Cert has 2 incident management assessments, both available for download. You can take a look at them. The incident management capability assessment looks at 71 different capability areas and looks at the programming aspects as far as what the preparations are, looks at detection, looks at response and analysis, and also sustainment. So do you have defenses in place for your own CSERT equipment? Do you have professional development? Those are some of the sustainment issues. For the preparation, do you have an incident management plan? Do you have a communications plan? Have you defined roles and responsibilities? For each one of those capabilities, there are a list of indicators that you have to meet to be able to meet that capability. We also have various instruments to help evaluate insider threat programs. And those are not available for download. An interesting one is from the Department of Homeland Security, their Cyber Resilience Review, that looks at 10 to 12 key areas, such as access management, identity management, incident management, vulnerability management, and lays out different goals, sees those that you're meeting, and gives you a maturity level. And then there are also the Security Incident Management Maturity Model, known as the SIM3. This is being used in the FIRST community, and they will be using this to help vet teams for joining FIRST. I put in a couple examples here. This is the Cert Mission Risk Diagnostic for Incident Management. This is the results that come out. There's 16 key drivers, and they ask various questions like, are your incident management objectives clearly defined? And then gives you some bullet points to say, what does that mean? And you answer yes, likely, yes, equally likely, likely, no, no. And you can see for this, you do that for the 16 different drivers, and you can see where some of your problem areas are. Same type of thing from the SIM3. And in this case, the SIM3 has 4 areas of parameters. They have organizational issues that are like, do you have definitions? Do you have your service levels? Do you have incident classification and severity? They have human parameters. Do you have a code of conduct? Do you have personal resilience, that you have surge support? Or you can, if you have to, you can do 24/7 coverage. Do you have the right skill set? They have tools. And it's interesting, the tools uses the word resilient a lot. You have resilient phones. You have resilient emails, you have resilient ticket tracker systems, and then process areas as escalation, resolution, feedback is being collected from the stakeholders. And then there are different levels that you can meet at, and you'll see all the different parameters. You get a spider diagram that shows you, again, your strengths and weaknesses. So that is just some of the different types of instruments that are out there. And just to wrap up, what we've seen in our years in doing incident management capability building and CSERT capability building is that when we look at novice versus mature teams, we've seen that the novice teams, of course, are usually struggling to establish relationships internationally, locally, across the country. with all the different stakeholders, and they often will need assistance and introductions. They are usually focused more on the reactive side of things rather than the proactive, because they're trying to handle the incidents as they come in, and they don't have as well-defined interfaces. They don't have everything documented that they should, and they don't always have their roles and responsibilities documented. And then you can see for mature teams, many of those things I said the novice ones don't have. You'll see that we see in the more mature teams having those documented processes and policies and procedures, so that as you have staff turnover, there are documented processes to follow and to use for training, that you understand who you're coordinating with and communicating with, what the right channels for that are, how to interface with your points of contact, that there is a focus on training and mentoring for the staff and professional development, that you have quality assurance. You're looking at how the activities are done, how the incidents are received, how they're analyzed, how they're handled, the response time, how long does it take to actually resolve the incident, and you're looking at those ways to improve. And again, that's where having those evaluation mechanisms come in. So just some of the things that we've seen novice versus mature teams, and there could be many different more bullets added to this. So that gives you a nice or a brief overview of some of the things that are out there and some of the reasons to evaluate, some of the instruments to use. And now I'll turn it over to Barbara to talk about the Mitre maturity model.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you, Travis. As you may remember, in session 1, you were given a very brief introduction to the Mitre Incident Response and Resiliency Readiness maturity model. Next slide, please. We showed you in session 1 this tiers and levels for incident response and resiliency readiness. Cybersecurity incidents experienced by critical infrastructure providers, the government, or virtually any other organization within your national cyber ecosystem may have significant negative impacts on the missions of the critical infrastructure operators. Minimizing the impacts of such incidents will require the victim organization to have a robust incident response and resiliency plan in place. Now, some organizations may have only a minimal capability in place, while others may have a more mature and robust capabilities. This incident response and resiliency readiness matrix is a resource to help organizations identify their respective level of readiness for identifying and responding to cybersecurity incidents. Organizations may use this matrix to determine the activities needed to advance to their desired level of readiness from the perspective of both the program management activities, which we describe as the program tiers on the left-hand side, as well as the technical activities defined as functional readiness levels on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. For the program readiness tiers, we go back to basically concepts from emergency planning as well as strategic planning. These concepts may already be familiar to organizations, even if cybersecurity incident response and resiliency activities are not yet robustly implemented. Program tiers and functional readiness levels are complementary measures that will help organizations assess the current state of their incident readiness and resiliency capabilities and identify concrete steps they can take to strengthen their programs. Now we have, for the program readiness, which is on the left-hand side, we have 4 tiers that talk about the organization's overall progress in implementing program management. Each of these tiers builds on the previous tier. So tier 1 is the initial. It organization is beginning to implement foundational activities. The organizations may have implemented some aspects of incident response or resilience, but the implementation is informal. Internal awareness of existing practices is limited, and required collaboration internally and externally is not carried out to an effective degree. Tier 2 is risk-informed. The implementation is based on organization-specific risks. Management is beginning to establish and prioritize incident response and resiliency activities based on organizational risk, and internal awareness of activities is increasing, but they're not yet consistent. Tier 3 is repeatable, consistently implementing activities across the organization and demonstrating awareness of the organization's position in the national cyber security ecosystem. This means the organization has an organization-wide approach to incident response and resiliency, and activities are expressed in well-managed policies. The organization is aware of cyber-related risks and that it uses information from interaction with others in the national cyber ecosystem to inform risk management decisions. Tier 4 is adaptive. This is the highest level of capability because the organization adjusts its activities as environment and risk change and actively participates in the national cyber ecosystem. This organization is agile. Next slide, please. So when we look at these particular tiers, we look at 3 dimensions for each of those tiers. We look at incident response and resiliency management process, which is the level of management involvement, the extent of policy formalization, and the link between incident response and resiliency policy and objectives. We look at organizational integration. So how much is incident response and resiliency embedded into the organizational policy, culture, and risk management decisions, and also participation in the national cyber ecosystem. Now, I'm not going to show you all 3 of those levels right now. I'm just giving you the example of what this tier looks like for the incident response and resiliency management process. And I'm not going to read each of the elements of these, but as you can see for each of the tiers, there's a description of the capabilities of a particular organization. So you can look at your own capabilities and determine which tier you are on for each of those organizational dimensions. And you can also see what do you need to do to progress up those tiers in making your program more ready for some kind of incident. Next slide, please. On that right-hand side of that tiered diagram, we have the functional readiness levels. And the functional areas that we look at to measure which level we're going to be at are preparation, analysis and triage, containment and neutralization, detection, leadership reporting and communications, and recovery. Those are the functional areas. And then we have the functional levels. Building, practices are not yet in place, but there's just some foundational ones. Foundational minimum practices are established. Strong, they're based on best practices for a fully functioning program. And advanced, activities extend beyond best practices, including proactive contributions to external communities. Next slide, please. Again, here's just a sample of how you can look at those functional readiness levels. On the left-hand side, we have, for example, the category of preparation that I mentioned. And so some of the things you would do under preparation include develop an incident response and resiliency plan. We've, of course, talked about how to do that in a prior session. And then we have descriptions of activities that would take you from just the lowest level, building, up to advanced. So as an organization, you can look at what do you need to do to move up those levels of functional readiness? Similarly, it's for managing internal and external stakeholders. For that one, for example, at the building level, some stakeholders are known. Then at the foundational level, stakeholder management plan addresses all internal stakeholders to carry out the basic capabilities. And then each step you move further and further along. Next slide, please. Also in the preparation category are vulnerability tracking and threat identification. And these are the kinds of capabilities we talked about in session 1 when we talked about risk management. And again, I don't want to go through and read every single box here. You will have an opportunity to see these slides, and you can look and see how this process works and how you can look at measuring where you are today as an organization and identify where you want to be and what you need to do to get there. I see that we have a hand up. Is there someone who has a question? If not, I'm going to now turn it over to Travis and to Rick and Cynthia, who are going to now talk to us about cyber coordination efforts. Thank you.
Okay, this is Rick. Thank you, Barbara. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, I think Cynthia is going to start out with this slide, but I just want to foot stomp it before she does. That the title is very important. It's the first foot stomper in this session. Is that this whole area is very complex, and we're going to try to help sort through that during this session. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning. So with the next little section, we're going to broaden our perspective on coordination a little bit from the incident response level to the national level. And as Rick introduced, national cyber coordination is a very complex undertaking. You don't need to be able to read all the little bubbles and squares on this chart. I just want you to take a look at how many pieces are coming together in this picture. Up at the top, we have some sort of a national cybersecurity coordination function, perhaps a center or council. That's an area where different ministries can come together. Down in the lower left-hand corner, we have different infrastructure sectors and their various sector CSERTs. Down in the right-hand corner, there's other government agencies that may have CSERTs of their own. Above that, we have public-private partnerships, such as ISACs and ISOWs, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later. Up in the upper right-hand corner, there's international partners, for instance, for battling cybercrime or for working other international problems in cybersecurity. And then inside that big green oval in the middle, we have some of the core functions that we're going to talk about tonight. The National CSERT or CERT is usually part of the National Cyber Coordination function, but it isn't usually in charge of it. There's usually somebody else who is coordinating all these very many pieces for the national government. Slide, please. For this reason, many governments find that establishing a single high-level focal point for national cyber coordination is very helpful, like a particular ministry or an office under some empowered part of the government. Some of the things a national cyber coordinator can help with is developing policy and legislative proposals to make sure that that the nation's laws reflect your needs in cyberspace and that your policies are in place to support and enforce those laws. effectively prioritizing and overseeing cyber investments so that different agencies or ministries or critical infrastructure providers don't pursue solutions that are ultimately incompatible or work against each other. And so that your nation's highest priorities, which are usually national security and economic security priorities, get taken care of in the cyber investments. They help ensure that stakeholders can be in touch with each other and cooperate. The cyber coordinator provides the ways and the convening areas for facilitating that stakeholder communications across both public and private sectors, usually in the strategy and cybersecurity arena. They provide guidance to critical infrastructure and other key stakeholders when those people don't know what standards they should follow or what policies are in place or what national priorities are and how they fit. The National Cyber Coordinator can help with that. And then finally, they oversee implementation to make sure that national cyber initiatives and programs, once they're started, can be sustained. Next slide, please. So some of those things might sound a little bit like a national CSERT, but as that first slide was trying to convey, the CSERT is typically focused on the kinds of incident response and incident preparedness functions that you've already been talking about. The National Cyber Coordinator, in contrast, is focused on all of that plus more, particularly in the strategy and policy level. They are responsible for making sure that your cyber strategy is compatible with and supports your other national strategies. For instance, developing a digital economy or something like that. The National Cyber Coordinator can help align those functions. A National Cyber Coordinator also typically possesses different authorities. They are able to direct other ministries usually, and they usually have the authority to deconflict concerns when there are conflicts between different agencies. For instance, between a regulatory and a law enforcement agency, or between a critical infrastructure provider and a policymaker of some sort. They typically bring together all the aspects of national cyber policies and operations, including incident response, but also strategy, and really importantly, resourcing. And they typically lead the implementation of national cyber policy, standards, and laws for the head of the government. Many cyber coordinators are also responsible for outreach and coordination with partners like legislators, regulators, and international entities, and also in the private sector and civil sector for academia or critical infrastructure providers. And they usually, finally, have a resourcing component or an influence that reflects the national priorities. So they don't just set policies, but they usually have some say in the national resourcing process to ensure that standards are complied with and that policies are implemented and appropriately resourced. Next slide. So some things that a National Cyber Coordinator can do, this is a little bit summing up from the slide before, is influencing but not necessarily controlling the allocation of resources by helping the country, the government, understand what its national cyber priorities should be. They help develop the policies, and this is very important that they do that in consultation with the affected stakeholders. This is because a single government office doesn't necessarily always know what the stakeholders are capable of implementing and what's appropriate for the equipment and architectures they have installed. So it's important that they consult together in the development of policies, but also that those policies really do improve security postures. They help establish and maintain the processes for communication and cooperation between all those actors that we looked at. And they typically have a national cybersecurity role. They don't necessarily do incident prevention, detection, identification, response, all those roles, but they typically make sure that all of those functions are integrated across government agencies and with critical infrastructure and other providers. They typically help determine how to organize the national Cert, and they may or may not oversee it. And they are also typically charged with establishing those productive relationships with law enforcement, the intelligence community, military and regulatory authorities who often have a role in major cyber incidents. And in all of these areas, it's very important that they work in cooperation with industry, civil sector, and others to stay on the same sheet of music with regard to national cybersecurity. Next slide. Okay, I know you can't read that little box over the side, and that's okay. Don't worry about it. The point is that there are many different approaches to national cyber coordination, and there is no one right answer. Different countries have taken different approaches to this function, and that's what that chart shows on the right. Across the top are several different countries with different governance structures and different approaches to regulatory law and criminal law. And as you can kind of see by the squares that are red or green or blue, different countries have chosen to empower their cyber coordinator with different authorities. Some of these authorities include, as we've discussed, policy development, policy enforcement, such as compliance audits, regulatory function like overseeing critical infrastructure and services. That's often one that gets delegated to different agencies. Convening or consultative authority, the ability to bring different players from industry, academia, and the government together. A liaison to international entities or to large industry functions. And an incident response role in the coordination and oversight piece, not typically down at the technical level. And then occasionally, some cyber coordinators may also have a law enforcement role. That isn't necessarily common, but some countries like Germany, which combines some policy and law enforcement functions in other areas, also does it with regard to cyber. But in most countries, and this is the bottom bullet and the bottom gray section of the table, law enforcement, regulation, and intelligence are usually primary functions that carry their own unique authorities. It's important, you've been talking a lot about roles and responsibilities. These three areas are areas in which national actor roles and responsibilities are extremely important. So we want to make sure that all of those areas have the authorities they need, but not more authority than they need. So we want those authorities to be explicit, limited, and clear in law so that they can perform their missions while also protecting sensitive businesses and privacy information. This is important so that constituents, business operators, private industry, critical infrastructure, so that they trust and have a good collaborative relationship with these entities. All right, next slide. All right, we're going to start talking about the things that were in that green bubble, and Rick is going to start that out.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. Appreciate it. So you'll note that this diagram of a notional national coordination ecosystem is a common thread through this presentation. And part of the reason for this is to orient you on what's coming next, which is discussions of functions and activities that point toward the operationalization of national cyber coordination. And they include threat and risk analysis, incident tracking, response coordination, incident investigation, cybersecurity awareness, and standards. And so what we'll talk about is, let's show the next slide. We'll start with response coordination. And I'll go through and kind of tee up and introduce this activity and function of response coordination. And then the following slide has a Mentimeter question where we will identify the benefits and challenges of response coordination at the national level. And so I ask you to start thinking about that as I introduce this topic, and we'll follow that same format through the 5 or 6 different white boxes or functional areas that we just discussed. And also feel free, if you have longer comments or specific questions that the Mentimeter brings out, to post them in the chat. And given our time constraints, we will address them to the best extent possible. Components of national cyber coordination, response coordination. So what it is a cooperative effort to involve all stakeholders in actions to identify, remediate, and recover from a cyber incident. You'll note in our previous discussions about incident management, this is a very closely related topic to response coordination. The perspective that we're coming from, however, is at the national level, vice the enterprise level or sector level. So here's an example. The National Cyber Coordinator may ensure that law enforcement, international partners, and other government agencies are coordinating with response entities like CSERTs or other designated response entities, to ensure that the overall national response is consistent and supports other national policy goals. This is important because, as Cynthia pointed out, the national coordination activity is really at the strategic level, whereas many of the activities of incident management entities are at the what we call operational level. So the role of government in this is to receive initial incident notifications, to really understand what's going on, what incident is occurring, what the consequences might be, and who might be affected, and what they might bring to the table in order to deal with it. The coordinator also needs to help share information or make sure that information is being shared amongst stakeholders who are identifying and responding to the incident. And the other thing that the national coordination effort can do is leverage the authorities of government entities, and not just the authorities of different government entities like regulatory entities or law enforcement entities, but also see that those authorities are applied in a way that supports kind of the national effort, in a way that is consistent with law, obviously, and with the intent of government, to protect the economy, to protect civil liberties, consistent with the goals of the government, and then obviously to protect the privacy and reputation of affected entities is really important. But I think equally important, a national coordinator is kind of responsible for ensuring that the integrity of the national response is maintained, and the reputation of government in its ability to deal with cyber incidents, cyber issues generally, is enhanced through a well-coordinated response activity. Now, the role of industry is varied, but industry actively participates in national incident response coordination by providing requested information and including access to systems as appropriate. And the caveat "as appropriate" is really an important caveat. Ideally, industry's role in response coordination is a proactive role, because both the government and critical infrastructure owners and operators have a common interest in protecting those assets and dealing with their disruptions. And so ideally, and we've talked about this a little bit in stakeholder engagement in previous sessions, this relationship is between industry and government is very cooperative and beneficial. Next slide. Okay, I think we'll turn the Mentimeter activity over to Joanna. Are we ready to do that?
Yes, let me share my screen. Okay, the poll is open. And our question is two parts. What are the benefits of response coordination for system owners and operators? And what are the challenges? So we'll give everyone a moment to respond. Let's see who will get the first answer in there.
Yeah, I think just to maybe prompt thinking about this a little bit, benefits could be related to information sharing, and because government normally possesses information that would be beneficial to the private sector to employ in responding to an incident. I think the second, this comment about subject matter expertise is really important. And I think this idea of subject matter expertise and technical support goes both ways. Industry can help government with their technical acumen, as well as government can help industry with the technical expertise they have in a Cert, for instance. And there we have a comment about receiving attack alerts, building trust. I think that's an excellent comment. And there's one comment here also on timely consensus of appropriate action. And I think, to me at least, the term consensus, when you're talking about a national cyber coordination activity, is very, very important. Because, again, it's a national cyber coordination is a complex activity, and you really need consensus on the objectives as well as consensus on the approaches to improving security, and the national coordinator should be a node for that type of activity. Okay. Okay, as the Cynthia, do you see anything you'd like to comment on?
I like the idea of building consistency and improving how rapidly we can respond to incidents. I do think that that participating in response coordination systems can help sort of exercise our muscles in incident response and make that coordination more consistent, faster, more coordinated. That's the one that really leaped out to me.
Yeah, that's excellent. This idea of a kind of single point of contact is a good idea and very closely related. There's a continual lament by industry that when there is a cyber issue, they're contacted by a large number of different government entities, and having a kind of a single point of contact in government really makes the public-private relationships and response coordination much more efficient and effective.
I think that that's true. I think it reduces the distractions that you have when you're trying to respond to an incident if you just have one point of contact to work through. I've also seen a lot of comments here on threat awareness, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about threat awareness in a couple of minutes, so I don't want to get into that. But that is an important piece of being involved in a response coordination system. I'm curious about that comment that says the operators won't help to contain the incident. I don't know if that was meant that way, or if the idea was that participating in a response coordination system is itself a distraction while the operators are trying to solve the problem. But I hope that in a well-run system, in a mature system, that incident response coordination is helpful and not a distraction, that it provides tools and resources that organizations might not have on their own.
Yeah, I think that comment may also be pointing to, again, the complexity of national cyber coordination, where all the stakeholders and partners may have different and competing objectives. So you may have industry that is a critical service provider that wants to maintain those services at all costs, whereas you have the government, and particularly law enforcement, coming in, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Coming in with their objectives as well, and adjudicating them is really important. And I think that's a role for the national coordinator as well.
I did just see that challenge roll up the screen, the challenge of different priorities. So that's recognized in the group.
Good, excellent. Okay, I think have we slowed down, Joanna? Are we ready for the next slide?
Yes, the response of it has slowed down. We're ready.
Okay, I think we're almost at the top of the hour. And we may want to take a break at this point, because I don't think we'll get through this section in 4 minutes. So does that is the consensus of the group that we break now?
Rick, we have this one slide and then a poll. Would you like to break?
Yeah, because I think the two come together, right?
Got it.
I can tee up the poll. If we take a break, it'll give people more time to maybe answer the Mentimeter, but then they won't be accomplishing the objective of the break. So, so I think we just take a break now. That's okay.
So it's 9:57. And so if we can come back at 8 minutes after 10, please.
สวัสดีค่ะแซงสกมช.นะคะขอรบกวนเวลาพักเบรกของท่านสักเล็กน้อยนะคะวันนี้นะคะหากท่านใดติดปัญหาในการประชุมวันนี้นะคะสามารถแจ้งผ่านแอดมินทางช่องไลน์หรือว่าทางแชทการประชุม Microsoft Teams ได้เลยนะคะขอบคุณค่ะ